and thanks for the invitation this evening. I'm going to just try and share my screen again so I can show you. Hopefully that's loading, and let me know when you can see that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some of our thinking about modular housing and specifically about modular supportive housing. I'm going to try not to steal Daniel's thunder about the design of these buildings, as I'm sure he's going to talk to you about their intentionality around that. So I'm just going to see if I can. Oh, there we go. Okay, so underpinning our approach on modular housing is a new affordable housing strategy. So Housing TO 2020 to 2030 was adopted back in December 2019, just in time for a new decade and a pandemic. It's a comprehensive approach to finding ways to address our affordable housing crisis that we're experiencing. It covers a full range of people who might need affordable housing. It covers a full range of programs and also policies. And a key focus is around the prevention of homelessness and making homelessness rare, brief, and one time. So it's an important foundation for the work that we wanted to do around new housing supply and particularly around modular housing. In this document, and the reason I mention this is because there's a big, sturdy, ambitious goal of 40,000 new affordable rental homes and supportive homes over the next 10 years. Of these 40,000, we wanted to deliver 18,000 of them as affordable homes with support services. And to do that and to respond to the kind of what even back in December 2019 was an emergency around homelessness, we thought it would be good to do at least 1,000 of those 18,000 as modular homes because they can be delivered so quickly. And it's such a timely response to what is a really serious issue. We're going to talk a little bit about the innovation around modular tonight and around the design aspects. But really, you know, and I'm interested to hear Kellie's presentation regarding shelter design. Shelter is clearly a life-saving intervention for many people. Without shelters, many, many more people would die on the streets as a result of homelessness. And that's clearly something that a compassionate city and a caring community want to avoid. But shelters don't provide the level of privacy or often the level of supports necessary to really provide someone with really good options for their future. We've also seen a real increase in the cost of delivering shelters, especially during COVID-19 crisis. And we're seeing that that cost has really doubled over that time period, and we see that at around you know, almost $6,000 per month for a bed. The same cost for operating to deliver a studio apartment with supports to an individual is around $2,000. So we're really trying to find ways to expedite and deliver more housing whilst we also maintain our shelter provision because it's so life-saving. So this is interesting kind of pivot that we're trying to do, which is to accelerate the housing supply. So one of the ways we did that is we kind of pitched to the federal and the provincial governments a housing and homelessness recovery and response plan, which included our desire to deliver around 3,000 permanent housing opportunities over the next 2 years. And we suggested that we would do this through a mixture of modular housing, a mixture of acquisitions, and also housing benefits as well. But what I wanted to mention to you tonight is particularly a focus on the modular supportive housing and really this idea that housing is health and that without it, we're unable to fully you know, be stable during COVID-19 and we won't be able to recover from it either. So it's a really important foundation for our community in terms of social and economic and personal well-being. Now, I'm looking forward to be able to replace this slide in my deck with a picture actually from the new affordable housing that we're due to open and that Daniel will talk about at Macy Avenue in Harrison. So this is actually a photograph from inside one of the modules that I worked on in Vancouver. They will be very similar, and I want to just highlight here, it's a very simple design, but very effective. So all of this comes, if you like, pre-built from the factory. So the units arrive with the furniture and all of the, window dressings, etc. in, and they come as, they're basically studio apartments. They're small living spaces, but with everything that you need to be self-sufficient. There's also some communal space in the building as well, where the staff who will work there to support the residents, providing a whole range of support services, including a food program, connection to learning and working opportunities, helping people connect to health services and navigating them towards a more, sustainable and enjoyable life for themselves. So I'm going to skip through these because I'm sure Daniel's got some much better pictures for you. But these are the designs for Macy and Harrison. And he's also, I'm sure, going to show and talk to you a little bit about the way that they're constructed and the way that they're delivered on site. They're basically built in a factory. We entered into an agreement with NRB and Horizon North, who were the same company that actually built these in Vancouver. And they were able to deliver on our schedule. Originally, we were looking to do a 12-month implementation for new modular housing, but when COVID-19 hit, we really tried to find ways to expedite the work here. And in addition to that, to expedite the need to find new kind of nonprofit providers who could help us provide the support services on site. So here are two of the key kind of organizations represented as part of this this project that we've been working on, and that this delivery of this first 100 homes. This first 100 homes that we're going to be delivering as part of a 250 unit pilot for modular housing. On the right hand side, you have Mayor Tory, and on the left hand side, you have the Minister of Housing, Minister Hussain, for the federal government. So both of these ministries, both of these organizations actually contributed significant capital dollars to this particular program in order that we could actually run the pilot and prove the concept here locally in Toronto. So a very important pilot for us, and one that we're hoping to build on very quickly. And here you have the kind of the groundbreaking, if you like, or the equivalent of a groundbreaking for Macy Avenue. And it's really, as you can actually see the modules in the background. So this would normally be, you would see something like this probably 18 months into the development of affordable housing project. And here we are within kind of 6 to 7 months of that project being launched, being able to kind of effectively start the work on site to complete the project. So that is one of the biggest benefits that you'll hear about modular housing, is really its speed. And again, the speed is not just to prove, an artificial concept, but really to help us deliver new homes for people who are currently experiencing homelessness as soon as possible. None of the work here will be effective in solving the issues that we face unless we're able to secure supportive housing dollars, operating dollars to go along with the capital investment. And we need that to pay for the staff who will work alongside the residents, providing them the support services that I mentioned earlier. So that's a big ask that we're making of the provincial government. For our first two projects, we were lucky enough to work with Cota Health and the neighborhood group, who were able to secure funding that they had from other sources. But moving forward, we're really hoping that the provincial government also joins us in delivering these kinds of homes for many, many more people. So just in wrapping up, I just want to make the point that housing as such, it's a foundation for all of us, despite I think how much many of us have complained about having to be at home over the last number of months. We're also, I think, deeply grateful that we actually have a home that we can isolate in if necessary, that we can protect our loved ones and try to rebuild our lives as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And housing, although clearly it's a human right and we should be working towards that progression of that right for many, many people, and there's a strong social justice argument about why we should deliver housing, it's also essential for our economic recovery as well. We're not going to be able to recover from COVID if many of the people who have now faced job insecurity or the loss of employment do not have a stable housing from which to recover from. So it's going to be a really important part of our current response to COVID-19 and also our future response in terms of the economy overall. And I will stop there and happy to answer questions after. Thank you.
Right, thanks so much, Abby. So we'll save questions for the end. For now, we'll move on to Daniel Ling.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Abby. So I will share my screen. Okay, can everyone see this okay? Sean, are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, excellent. All right, let me get started. Okay, so maybe I could just start by saying, as a practice at Montgomery Sisam, it does mean a lot to us to be able to help and lend a hand during this time to be able to make a difference through design. So I won't get into a lot of the backgrounds which Abby has introduced already and try to focus more on the design. So the two sites, 150 Harrison and Macy. Harrison is roughly around the Dundas Street West and Dover Court on the west side, and 11 Macy is by Victoria Park and Danforth over to the east. These are not big sites. They're compact sites on city-owned lands within existing residential neighborhood with access to public transit. The Macy site is about 220 by 120 feet. And the Harrison site is roughly 150 by 150. So they're both quite suitable for modular systems while they're still compact. So the plan is really to deliver 44 homes in 11 Macy and 56 homes on 150 Harrison. The exterior of the building is really an expression of the modular design. The grid you see on the elevation both breaks down the scale of the building, but it really also serves as a practical purpose of allowing the modules to be joined together after they are craned into place. So the cladding is completed on site at the joints only. When we typically think of this design of modular construction, there tend to be a connotation of something perhaps industrial or institutional. So one of the interesting design challenge for us here is to provide something that's appropriate for the residential neighborhood in terms of scale and identity. So in addition to the building expression, I think the material, the exterior siding that was selected is really intended to give it a residential quality. Natural wood, in this case, natural cedar, was also introduced as an accent, particularly at the pedestrian level to give it a sort of tactile quality at the human scale. The planning is quite simple. So each module has 2 units with a corridor in the middle. In addition to the apartment unit, there's also shared dining, kitchen, laundry, and staff and support services on the ground floor. As Abby mentioned earlier, the typical unit is your studio unit. It's about 300 square feet with its own kitchen, bathroom, which includes a shower. Both a standard unit as well as a barrier-free unit fits into a typical module. So while the unit is quite compact, it's also quite functional. We've introduced a fairly large window that is operable to give lots of natural daylight and air into the room. So for us, this is more than just providing housing to get folks off the street. It's also about city building. There's a mandate, as Abby mentioned, to build this really fast, but as architects, we also want to build something that's permanent, something that's timeless, something that contributes to the city fabric. So this is an animation that's going to take us through the two sites. So the first one is Macy Avenue. What you're looking at there on the right side is the main entrance with the wood trellis and the canopy. On the Macy site, there's actually a through block connection that cuts from east to west in the form of a landscape path. And then so it cuts from Macy Avenue to St. Dunstan's to the east, and it provides a public connection to an adjacent park on the east side of St. Dunstan. The site's quite interesting. There's almost a one-story slope where the east side is higher by 1 story. So it provided us an opportunity to create a sunken garden that forms an amenity space for the residents that provides intimacy, but also privacy to the adjacent properties. So there's picnic tables, barbecue, outdoor seating. And then we're gonna go inside and look through a typical room. Now on the Harrison site, even though the design is very similar, because the way the building is configured on the site, the perception of the building is quite different, where the long side of the building with all the residential windows are facing the street. The site also has a corner condition with a park in the corner. So the narrow end of the building really faces and acts as the backdrop to a future public park. And we've actually changed the siding at the end there to respond to some of the context of the adjacent building, but also to allow the building to recede. Here's a detail of the elevation where you see some of the wood cedar slats that really gives it a more tactile quality and a fine grained scale. Of course, NRB was the builder who built this. It was managed by Creatio. So just to touch a bit more on the design of modular construction, why was modular construction suitable for this? What did the project gain from it? What was innovative about modular design? I think as Abby mentioned earlier, speed is clearly one key characteristic of this type of construction. In this particular modular design, I think the second thing that's quite unique, it's quite important to mention, it's really simplicity. These are very simple wood frame modules. They are electric from a mechanical electrical system perspective, so it doesn't consume any gas. It has quite a low carbon footprint. And unlike your typical condo, these are not glass building. They're highly insulated walls with high performance windows, so they're quite energy efficient. I mean, one thing that is that's quite an advantage for modular construction is the quality control. So all the work is done in the shop. There's minimal site labor. Each module is about 12.5 feet wide by 65 foot long, so it fits in a tractor trailer. And in this case, Abby mentioned earlier, the furniture is all done inside, and they shrink wrap it and it gets shipped. And one can actually crane the module directly off of the tractor trailer onto its final position. So it's quite fast. So the 56 apartments on the Macy site was assembled in within a 2-week duration. So the photo that Abby showed you earlier with the groundbreaking, that was around a week before this, right? So this is how fast it is. There's no separate structure. These are self-supporting modules. So it's very simple. There's no parking on the site. just bicycle parking, so there's very minimal foundation work. Mentioned earlier that these sites are quite compact, so they're appropriate. While they're appropriate for the residential neighborhood because they're low, they're 3-story. They're also quite efficient in terms of site utilization. So what is equivalent of a size of the site for 6 single-family houses fits 56 homes. So, you know, often the question we're getting asked is, how is this applicable to other projects? What can we learn from this? I think, as some of you know, at the end of September of this year, the government announced the Rapid Housing Initiative, which is a $1 billion program to create up to 3,000 affordable housing units across the country, whether it is rental, supportive, or senior housing. So this is directly applicable to that. So, I mean, we've shown you 2 projects that are near completion. What I'd like to do is give you a sneak preview of a 3rd project we're working on that's just on the board, still in the design phase. So while the first project is in an urban setting, the next one that we're working on is in a rural setting. And we've taken what we learned from the first 2 and tried to evolve it and innovate it in this 3rd one. So this is for the Durham region. It's about an hour and 20-minute drive north of the city. It's near Beaverton. And what is unique about this project, this model, is we've introduced a hub building as part of the modular design. So the plan is quite simple. There is 20 modules, but it's separated into a hub building, which contains the dining room, kitchen, and support services, which is 1 story, and a 3-story residential building that's very much like the Macy and Harrison model. And the idea here is community integration. While the hub building provides food and support services for the residents, it also becomes an amenity to the neighborhood, to the neighbors, and to the community. You can see the separation of the 2 buildings creates opportunity for courtyards, but also there's 2 notches in the building that creates a dining terrace in the dining building, in the hub building, and a residential forecourt in the residential building. Along the theme of, you know, how does one transform the preconception of modular design, modular construction into something that's less institutional? We, you know, within the rural setting, we're really looking for inspiration in the landscape, inspiration in the towns, to come up with a palette of natural material. Also notice that in this case, we've changed the roof form into a slope roof form to create massing that is more interesting and more appropriate within the context. So here's the entry court into the residential building. So the notch that you see out of the plan there becomes something that's lined with cedar to create a really tactile, welcoming moment in the building. And then here's the courtyard that's created by the gap in between the 2 buildings that's connected by the link. So the residents, you know, going from their room to the dining will be walking through a link past some landscape courts. And then this is the hub building. And again, there's a notch created in the building that creates a cutout that provides a dining terrace, an outdoor space. The interior of the buildings are intended to really create a residential quality and lots of natural daylight. Connection between the building is, you know, accented by landscape views into the courtyard. And then this is within the hub building. There's a reading room that has a cedar wall with a fireplace, and lots of opportunity for seating that looks out into the dining terrace. And this is the dining room. So think it's quite exciting for us to, I mean, these projects, because they're so fast, in some way they're like rapid prototyping. You learn from one and you apply it to the next, and you just evolve them, make each one better and better and better. I think these projects, these modular housing projects, started with the main objective of helping people experiencing homelessness and giving them a home. But I think as architects, we like to think that perhaps we can aim a little higher and do better than just providing a home, more than just the physical needs, but perhaps through the design, through whether it's the quality of light or the sense of place that we can create, that we can give them something that benefits their mental well-being as well. We can give them dignity, a sense of belonging, a sense of community. Okay, I will stop there. Oops.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Daniel. Very engaging video. So we'll save the questions again for the end. And we'll move on to Kellie.
Okay, I will just share my screen. Okay, hi, as Sean mentioned, I'm Kellie. I'm a project designer at Workshop. And in addition to working with Shelter Support and Housing Administration to deliver 1,000 new shelter beds within the city, my research partner, Naomi Shuchuk, and I received grants from the OAA and the RAIC to sort of revisit shelter spaces when considering the pandemic. And so this presentation will look at design principles within these spaces, but beyond that, it will look at some of the surrounding framework that guide these principles, because a lot of this information actually comes from design guidelines and public policy. And so while I'm not a public policy expert, some other members on the panel can probably speak to this a little better. I am going to examine the role of architecture and design at each of these levels, starting with what we currently have, moving through recommendations moving forward. So starting off, how has COVID-19 affected the shelter system? Why do we even need to revisit these spaces? Well, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we can see that COVID-19 has highlighted some serious shortcomings with the existing system. Most contrasted when you're comparing the infection rates against the rest of the city of Toronto. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the city has adopted new measures to sort of slow that infection rate within the shelter system. But it's not really a surprise that this happened to begin with. Health profiles have shown over time that buildings which are overcrowded and underserviced increase the potential spread for communicable diseases. And especially in the beginning of the pandemic, people took note, right? Like this is when you start to see the encampments really coming up in the city. So it goes to show that at least ostensibly, people are determining that encampments are safer than the shelters. So pre-pandemic versus current shelter standards, how are they designed? What do they look like? Well, there are certain shelter standards with set criteria that define certain spaces. Pre-pandemic in sleeping areas, what this looked like was in sleeping areas, 0.75 lateral separation between beds and a personal space minimum requirement of 3.75 square meters. So beds are pretty close together. Since the pandemic, the city has adopted new measures in shelter spaces to accommodate for social distancing set forth by public health guidelines. But this has reduced the shelter capacity by around half, and you can imagine on an already overburdened shelter system, this greatly reduces shelter capacity to accept new clients. To accommodate for this, the city has opened up a number of temporary emergency respite facilities to relieve some of this burden in the form of respite facilities in hotels or vacant buildings. But there's still a large number of people sleeping in encampments, suggesting that, again, at least ostensibly, these new shelters aren't meeting client needs. Looking a little further into what a shelter looks like, here's a diagram. Typically, we don't show floor plans of completed buildings just because of the sensitive nature of the work. So here's just a diagram of what a shelter space could look like based off of the design guidelines. So you have rooms which are shared spaces. So this is with the new social distancing guidelines, often shared washrooms, dining area and a client lounge. The blue represents spaces meant for staff or client operators. So it's just a separated out space. In this talk, typically when I'm referencing shelter, I'm referencing one of two kinds, and that's either a permanent congregate shelter, permanent meaning the building is purpose-built to be a shelter, that's its intended use, or an emergency respite facility. This is more temporary rapid response housing, and it can take many forms. For example, I don't know if you've seen those big white dome tents around Toronto, that's an example of that. This diagram here is an example of the former with the permanent congregate type shelter. Just a bit of a snapshot of where we're currently at. Abby spoke to this a little bit. The city has recently released its interim shelter recovery strategy. And in this, there is a strong emphasis on a housing first approach. And what this means is sort of we want to tackle housing insecurity before it reaches homelessness. And for good reason. There's room for architectural intervention here to offer quick, rapid construction like modular housing, as well as deeply supportive or affordable units to sort of address an overburdened system, because right now shelters are often used as a catch-all to house all populations who are experiencing housing insecurity. And in the long run, you really do start to see your return on investment with a housing first approach. And as Abby mentioned, this won't completely eliminate the need for permanent congregate or emergency respite facilities because people still really benefit from those closer supports. And so when considering health within these spaces, how can we sort of revisit these spaces? Well, when speaking to experts in the field, they say when it comes to reduction of infection spread, there really isn't a secret. You wash your hands, social distance, wear masks. We're all really familiar with it at this point, but that there is an element missing from the typical public health agenda, and that's designing for dignity. And so it seems like a really abstract concept, but I think as architects and designers, we're already really familiar with this, right? Like when considering spaces for private dwellings, there's building codes and policies that ensure each person has a reasonable amount of private space and just space in general. And so how can we consider some of these elements when designing for those experiencing homelessness? I think inherently some of the other notions with the housing first approach and modular housing really starts to inherently address this. People can have that ownership and privacy and dignity. But when it comes to these other shelter spaces, I think we have to work a little bit harder to gain it. And so what this means, again, is just opting for privacy and ownership. On the right is just an interior of a shelter space workshop worked on. And it's simple things like just putting partitions in between beds so you're not staring at 50 people while you're sleeping. The bottom photo just shows a reading lamp at the bed. And it's something that sounds super simple, but if you can imagine the ability to control light in your own personal space versus the ability not to, it makes a pretty big difference. Another item is just making sure that there's no hierarchy between operator staff and client residents. There does need to be some separation in terms of safety, but this shouldn't communicate a power imbalance. And what I mean by that is if you picture a space for staff that's nice with nicer finishes, and then a space for clients, which is a little bit less nice, and then you put a giant glass partition in between those two spaces, you can begin to imagine what that starts to communicate. Right now, it's sort of up to the shelter operator or the architect to sort of request these additional elements, but I do think there is opportunity to put some of these items into the design guidelines and standards so we can ensure a baseline of dignity is provided to all residents. Another item that isn't really as prevalent in the design guidelines is outdoor and communal spaces. sort of when you think about it right now, a lot of these community spaces are within the community. You know, you're thinking about your library, your community center, or McDonald's. But during the pandemic, these aren't as readily available, or at least their capacity is greatly reduced. And so how can we write these elements into sort of these shelter spaces? This is an example of a sunken courtyard at a shelter workshop is working on. It's under construction, so it's just a hole in the ground for now, but it will be a sunken courtyard similar to the one that Daniel had presented with the modular housing. But it does offer the opportunity to gather with friends in an outdoor space that's at least semi-private and where you can gather safely. So I think, again, there's opportunity to write some of these elements within the guidelines to ensure that they're replicated amongst other shelters. So just quickly looking ahead, I'm sure the question on everyone's mind is how can we address homelessness before the upcoming winter? I'm sure we'll discuss that a lot in the upcoming discussion. But the interim shelter strategy, recovery strategy did mention that it's aiming to address concerns, or at least the perception that encampments are safer than shelters. A lot of work has been done since the initial outbreak to sort of address this. And I do think that there's additional opportunity here to showcase ways that architecture and design can address additional health concerns which aren't as prevalent on a typical public health agenda, and that's designing with dignity in mind. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Yeah, that was great. Okay, so I've collected a few questions, and for those that are still thinking through what you want to ask, feel free to put those in the chat as you come up with them. But kind of the first question I have here is from Loren, and they're curious about how consultation, what was the role of consultation in the design of these modular housing units and the shelter design? Were there particular features or amenities that were frequently requested, and did that change how you design them?
Well, maybe I can start. I mean, I'm assuming from the question that people are interested in kind of consultation with people with residents who ultimately live in these units, as well as kind of the nonprofit operators and also the community around the outside. I might let Daniel speak to some of the consultation and dialogue we had with community about the design of the building, but certainly from the perspective of future residents, the first building or couple of buildings that I worked on back in Vancouver were somewhat different in terms of the design. There wasn't as much communal space in the units. There wasn't a commercial grade kitchen where you could run a full food program. And we heard from, I think, both the residents and the feedback from the staff who worked in these buildings that they felt that the addition of that extra space on the ground floor would really, add and bring a stronger sense of community to the building, that people would have more space to build that. So that was one of the main changes that we made as we rolled out that plan. Right now, those buildings are very similar. The ones in Toronto are very similar, and we're looking forward to getting feedback actually for these buildings when they open from the current residents, and looking forward to refining and improving our design work moving forward.
Maybe I'll just add to that on the more of the public consultation side in terms of the neighbors and the neighborhood community and some of the comments and suggestions and concerns they have. There was quite a bit of emphasis on integration into the neighborhood. Is this building, both in terms of the use, but also in terms of the design, massing, height, build form, character and identity of the building, is it appropriate for the context of the street or the neighborhood? Is there sufficient privacy provided between the residents looking out of the building or their outdoor amenities to the neighborhood backyards or their living room or their kitchen, the oversight, the look? Is there sufficient landscape screening between the housing project and the adjacent private residence. And then 2 other details such as sight lines, site safety, site lighting, the type of pathways you provide around the building, and generally how does it impact people that are living around the area. So those are all really important factors to consider.
Thank you for that. So then we have Baldwin is wondering about the broader issues of modularity and multi-residential design. Are there a number of different groups looking at these issues, or is it just kind of the city for now?
Well, I'm getting quite a lot of interest from other cities as well. So it may not just be the ones that we mentioned here, but I'm getting a fairly regular kind of calls to our office about what we're doing and why and how we're doing it. So I think it's fair to assume that there's a number of other groups, cities, architects, people looking to see how they can use modular housing or elements of modularity in their design. And certainly, as we mentioned, I think Daniel mentioned or made reference to the Rapid Housing Initiative that the federal government has just launched. That's $1 billion across Canada, and you can only spend that money either on modular housing or on the acquisition of an existing building that isn't already residential. So there are some fairly clear swim lanes, if you like, around that money. So I would imagine it has many people across the country kind of looking to see whether they can include an element of modular housing, maybe not the entire building, but certainly there are also panels. There's different ways to approach modularity. So I anticipate, yes, that there are a lot. I couldn't name, or maybe it's not fair to name them tonight, but yes, I think it's something that a lot of exploration and work is being done on right now.
And I think it goes beyond just modular supportive housing. We're looking at other building types that are interested in this type of construction, such as long-term care. There is also a rapid delivery program on that as well, and a real need during this time.
I guess just building on that too, I have my own question, which is what kind of precedents both Kellie in terms of shelters and then in terms of modular housing, like Vancouver has experimented with modular housing already for the last year or years, correct?
Yeah, and so I think there's tons of examples of this. There's the example of Marpole in the Vancouver region. And I think there was some questions popping up in the chat just about community perspective around it. I think this is a really great example that speaks to something that wasn't necessarily initially welcomed by the community. But again, with modular housing, residents are able to experience a little bit more ownership of space and start to heal from everything that's homelessness it sort of happens when you're experiencing homelessness. And I think that was able to be reflected within the community, because after the fact, it received a much more warmer welcome once this was sort of reflected in the community. People were dropping off furniture. There really was that shift in perspective. So I think just from the community aspect, you really do start to see these things reflected in that.
Yeah, maybe I could just add, I think that it's always really helpful when, designers and architects do such a thoughtful job in relation to how the buildings are positioned, how they look in relation to the neighboring community. It removes often or makes one aspect of the conversation much easier. I think, though, I probably would be remiss to say that many of the discussions and concerns that we hear raised by community are less to do with the design of the building as they are to do with the future residents of the building, and fear around the mental or physical health of those residents, and some of the stigma that exists in a very widespread way about the behavior and experiences of people who are homeless, and what that is, how that might be like to change their neighborhood. And so I think Kellie made a good point that actually once these buildings are open and many of those things do not manifest themselves in the way that people perhaps anticipated, that is one of the best ways to kind of repeatedly demonstrate that this housing first approach and that housing is the best solution both for the individuals involved and for our community as a whole.
Okay, we have another question. Has Toronto looked at something like the IBA? Baldwin, I'm not sure what the IBA is. Maybe you could explain that. Yeah, and so who will be kind of the first to be able to access these units? I think it's an important question.
Yeah, so the two nonprofits who we have working in partnership for the first 100 units is the Neighborhood Group and Kota Health, and they're working actually very closely with our SSHA colleagues at Shelter Support and Housing at the city and a number of referral agencies as well, identifying people who are suitable and who want to move in. That's a kind of core element of Housing First. It is actually a choice involved, that people choose to live here and they choose to make their life in these new homes. So they're working really hard to do that, and we anticipate in the spirit of a rapid and emergency response, we anticipate people moving in very, very soon, in a matter of hours and days after the buildings are ready for occupancy. So that will be in the very, very near future. We're anticipating within the next few weeks for Macy, which is really exciting.
Okay, then we have another question. So this modular housing program kind of predated COVID. So what kind of design considerations have come up since then and demanded changes?
Yeah, perhaps I can start. I mean, pretty rational things, I think, that are not surprising to hear. Where do you put places to wash your hand? If someone's lining up for food, how does that work? Providing flexibility. Certainly, I think the question around mechanical systems are a very hot topic around the engineering side. It applies to housing, but when you get into something that's even more critical, like long-term care, then there's a whole aspect of how do you filter the air on that. And then generally flexibility, if there's an outbreak, how do you create the circulation such that you could maybe isolate certain part of the building? So all of those things I think are relevant and sort of pretty hot topics in the design community when we look at these type of buildings right now.
Maybe I can just add that, it's important, obviously, to think about those things in relation to design right now. And I very much appreciate the work actually that Kellie has shown us tonight about the kind of the thoughtful approach to shelters moving forward, because many of the changes I think that we're responding to from COVID will actually be things that we would want to continue. I would say, though, that, for example, one of the challenges in the buildings when they first open is the communal areas in the buildings because of the nature of the spread of the virus right now. I wouldn't want at this point to support a shift away from having communal areas in these buildings. I don't know that we've given up this fight yet against COVID-19 and that we would want to fundamentally change the important aspects of buildings that do build community. I think we're all hoping that there will be a vaccine and over the next year, I hate to say it, a year, 18 months, we can start to return or get to a new normal, a better normal, I think. But at this point, from somebody who is talking to architects and talking to designers and modular housing buildings about these new buildings, we're not removing the communal aspects of buildings just yet, and I don't think we will be doing that. It's just a case that the operators may in the short term be managing those spaces a little bit differently for the time being.
So there's another question here from Michelle as well. So in addition to just receiving housing, are there other policy or programs in place that people will have access to around that site, like a rent subsidy, etc.?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So one of the reasons why it's so important for us to have an operating subsidy for these buildings is so that rent subsidies can be provided. We want these homes to be affordable for those people who are experiencing homelessness, and so in many cases they may not have an income at all, or they may be on an extremely low income. So it's very important that they're able to afford the rent. So these buildings are, rental apartments that people do pay rent, and they're a tenant with the full rights of a tenant, but that the rent is affordable to them. So that's really important. One of the reasons why we need that operating subsidy. And the other thing is that the work of the nonprofit operator is that much easier if we locate these buildings already within strong and vibrant communities, which have a place to do your grocery shopping, easy access to transit, close to a library or some other kind of community facilities. So they will be supporting residents to access the community in and around the immediate vicinity of the building, just like you or I would as well. So it's important to locate these buildings so that they're not in an area that's too removed from everything you would need for daily life.
Okay, and then we also have another question about shelters. Are there any immediate plans to change emergency shelter design in Toronto? Kellie, I know you're already working on changing the design, but are there more immediate concerns?
Well, I think, specifically in response to COVID-19, a lot of the emergency shelters have taken form in the part of the city acquiring new buildings to sort of offload some of the existing shelters. So just by default, some of these emergency shelters, the design is inherent in the existing building, and a lot of them are hotels. And so I think the design aspect from that is a little bit more contingent on which property is being acquired. As far as the existing shelter, again, it's just currently a lot of the nuances are currently up to the shelter operator, a lot of nonprofits who are operating out of this. So I see the question that you're referring to here. It's referencing some of the viral images from the city's emergency living spaces that have come up. Again, I think a lot of these elements that I was describing earlier, there's opportunity to write them into the design guidelines to ensure some of these items don't actually take place, because we are dealing with a lot of stakeholders here, right? It's not just the designer, it's not just the city, it's not just the clients, it's not just the operator, it's a lot of people involved. And so just because of the quantity of stakeholders, I do think that it should lie within the design guidelines.
Interesting. So then we also have a question for Daniel from Mark Richardson regarding, so currently we can achieve approximately 50 units per site on the sites that have been so far developed. Are there methods to more efficiently stack the modular units to achieve more density? And what are the zoning challenges to doing this?
Right, good question. Because not every site has the same footprint and height limits. Look, the ones that we presented today are wood modules, so they're combustible construction, and so this particular system will go up to 4-story or 5-story, fairly without much design changes, and that would comply with OBC the same way that the 3-story version is. Once you get above 5-story, then we have to look at the structure as well as other building code implications. Now, on the other hand, these are also can be done in steel modules, which means they're non-combustible and we can go higher than 6, 7, 8 stories. But again, it really comes down to the site and what's appropriate in terms of zoning, but as well as in terms of the context. A lot of these sites we're looking at are in residential neighborhoods. So certainly even though physically can build up higher, it might not be appropriate.
Okay, and then we have a question. So modular housing is obviously one kind of innovation, one pathway towards providing additional supportive housing. But there's also efforts to acquire existing apartments, hotels, and renovate them. So what are kind of the challenges around redesigning existing hotel spaces to provide dignified housing?
I think I can speak a little bit to that. Because we're working with existing infrastructure, and a lot of these buildings were built, in the 70s or earlier. They're not up to, even just for a regular hotel, they're not up to today's standards. And so it's actually, there's a lot of work involved just to get them even to just standards with accessibility alone. We're talking 14-story buildings with no elevator here. I did recently tour a lot of the emergency facilities that were required, and it is safe to say that it would require some serious overhaul to get them even up just to barrier-free standard, let alone designing with dignity. So I do think that there is there are some challenges with just even building selection that can come with trying to find these housing typologies pretty quickly, just to name a few.
Thanks for that. Does the city have strategies for mitigating resistance to modular housing sites from the surrounding community after residents move in?
We've worked really hard as a team with the architects, the operators, and community consultants to ensure that residents immediately around these buildings had access to, if you like, the facts with regard to these buildings. Can we do a better job with next time with the next building? Absolutely. We're going to explore lots of different ways to ensure that residents both have information about how the building will be built, what it's going to look like, who's going to live there, how their neighborhood will or won't change as a result of these buildings. But ultimately, I think the work also that we need to do is actually in conversations like this that aren't site specific and that aren't really just about the site next to you and your neighborhood, but to kind of grow a better understanding across the city about how housing like this, how supportive housing can change people's lives for the better and provide an important resource that we all take for granted, or many of us, around having a home, and that it's actually through sharing that information and sharing the opportunity that we have when we do get government money, that we can kind of spread the word, if you like, that housing really is the answer. Housing first really is the answer to many of the issues that we see in our city, and we need to start to dispel more myths about people who are experiencing homelessness and start to spread more broadly how actually if we work harder on this, we can actually make a real impact over the years ahead. Because sometimes I feel that many of us or people that I speak to, many people who do kind of support these efforts, also sometimes find that maybe the problem is so intractable that it can't be dealt with or can't be solved, and kind of lose hope around that. And I guess some of these buildings and this work is kind of trying to show the opposite, that actually there are very real things that we can do, very practical things that we can do very quickly, and we should be working hard to do more of that. So I'm very grateful for opportunities like this when we can kind of show and talk about what's working or what could work, and that we all in our own professional network certainly spread some of that information, and we start to build a better collective understanding about this future that we want to create here with buildings like this. So
Right.
go tell your friends, basically.
All right, Abby, there's another question for you. Given the expiry date on the CMHC Rapid Housing Funds, March 31st, 2022, so in the next 16 months, how many additional modular housing sites is the city expecting to approve as new builds in 2021?
I should check maybe who asked that question. But
It's Mark Richards.
yeah, okay, I know that. So we're working, I think it's fair to say, pretty flat out at the moment to get our investment plan in to CMHC, the closing date for which is the 27th of November. So we had about 27 days to really pull that together. We're just in putting the final touches to our investment plan, and we will likely hear back from CMHC by the end of the year, or that's what we're hearing. Actually, the date is sooner than that. We're anticipating having to have any units that we buy, convert, or construct in modular finished and occupied by the end of 2021. So that is a significant factor involved in our decision about which buildings we're going to include in that investment plan, because speed really is going to be one of the biggest factors in us being able to secure as much money for the city as possible. So it's worse than March 2022, or better, depending on what your view is. It's going to be end of next year. So.
Okay, and then we have a question from Emma. Does anyone have any insight as to better ways to deal with disconnected funding streams? So supports through the LHIN that aren't often committed in time for the design process.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also like to hear kind of Daniel and Kellie's view on this. We're often in a position of having to design without, a complete funding or operating package in place. Like I said, we're doing what advocacy we can, but I'm sure it's difficult for those people working on design to not completely know sometimes what the operating funding or all of the operations, because all funding does is provide programming and staff in a building. So if you don't know all of that, it must be hard to kind of really put as much thought into some of the designs as you would like. But I'd be interested to hear whether there were any issues about that. Again, we're just working hard to connect some of those pieces. So working with the LINs, which was mentioned, for trying to find nonprofit providers who have access to money that we may not be aware of. And so we've included that in our request for proposals, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I guess to Abby's point, I mean, the first two that we showed today was designed, almost in parallel, or maybe even before the operators were on board, right? So it was based on the basic assumption of a program and designing to it and allowing enough flexibility so that the different operators can, adapt their program to it. The third one we're working on now, we're designing in conjunction with the people that are running it. And so it becomes a lot more tailored to the specific needs and the specific operation approach. So I think either way works. I mean, we're all working under a constraint of time of getting these delivered quickly, and it's not going to always be sequential and ideal. But if in the case where you don't have the operator on board, then you really have to think through and design with the most flexibility in place.
And I think I'd like to just add a little bit on to that, especially when considering retrofitting existing buildings. There is a lot of conversation just in, I guess, housing advocacy communities right now, just why can't the city just grab vacant buildings and use them? But I do think there are expensive challenges related to this. And HVAC systems to accessibility upgrades. It can even be more costly to retrofit an existing build than to just build straight from scratch. So again, if there was more money, that would be great. But again, it's just more finding additional funding streams to support this.
On that point, so to what extent are these projects being developed on public land versus acquisitions? Is it primarily public land so far?
So the two sites that we're doing right now in Toronto are both on public land, and certainly we're looking at that for our phase 2 as well, and we're also looking around for public land in the main for our rapid housing initiative kind of focus, but it's possible to do it also on other people's land. It's just you're really ideally looking for a landowner who's not looking for a massive return on their land in a way that most landowners are in major cities. So if you can find one who's not looking for that, then it makes the project much more cost effective to put kind of public dollars into. And actually in Vancouver, they were able to find some developers who were willing to allow their land to be used for kind of 5 to 10 year periods of time. So they actually put modules on temporary sites. So the modules themselves can be moved. They're just as high quality as all the ones that you'll see that you saw today. But in 5 years, when the developer is ready to build their kind of big affordable housing project and market housing, they can move the modules to a different site. So it's just a slightly different model, which enables it to be easier to use kind of pieces of land that might be available for a limited amount of time because of other development and stuff. So that's something we've thought about. At this point, we're using permanent sites that are available permanently. But the modular is great precisely because it can be moved. As you saw, the fact that it can be craned in means it can at some point be craned out if necessary. So it's an interesting aspect to the project, which is worth considering maybe at some point if we're looking for other pieces of land.
But on that point again, the current sites, they're kind of meant to be relatively permanent, correct?
Oh yeah, they're permanent, and certainly these buildings, and Daniel can speak to this, such a high quality. In fact, when we, taking city officials who are responsible for kind of approving projects into the factory, they were amazed because you're building housing in a quality controlled environment, which is not something you could normally say about your average construction site. So, actually in terms of the quality, I think we get a really good, provides a really good deal for us.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these are designed as permanent buildings. It's got a permanent concrete foundation. The wall assembly, the windows, the roof is no different than you would build in any other permanent housing project in terms of the quality and the performance.
All right, and so we have about 14 minutes left, so I'm still soliciting some more questions. But one more I might ask is, what is the role of kind of accessibility concerns in both the shelters and in the modular housing, and how have you designed those into them?
Well, I can speak as far as, as designers, we're often concerned with barrier-free accessibility, and especially when considering retrofitting spaces, this does often require a lot of space, especially with the hotels. To create a barrier-free washroom, you're knocking down an entire washroom just to get that turning radius that's required to accommodate for a mobility device. And it's no changes in grades between level, or if there is one, there's an adequately sloped ramp to accommodate for it. And so again, it's really trying to find buildings that can A, support this, and B, if it doesn't support it, how can we effectively incorporate these elements into the buildings?
Daniel, did you want to speak to any of the
Sure. I mean, on the supportive housing side, yeah, I mean, the buildings are designed to be completely barrier-free. I mean, and there's an elevator that we've incorporated into the prototype. Basically, every level is barrier-free. you know, as I showed earlier in the diagram, the standard module will fit a barrier-free suite or a typical suite. And any of the lounges, other supporting spaces are designed to have the appropriate turning radius and, you know, the door types and so on. So there's no limitation because it's modular construction that makes it not barrier-free.
Okay, and then we have a question about more of a policy question to how long do we expect clients and tenants to rent in these units? And are to what extent are they understood as transitional versus kind of short to long term?
As long as they want, basically. So these are designed to be permanent, both in terms of the design of the building, but also in terms of the tenancies themselves. So this is not, these two buildings and this pilot is not considered to be transitional housing in the sense that there's a kind of an end date that's set. We may include, because of some of the CMHC funding, one of the projects may have a number of units in them that has more of a transitional nature, but they won't be different units. It'll more just be where the people are coming from, you know, and where they're coming from in terms of referrals and where they're on their way to. But the majority of units in these buildings, you can move in and you can stay as long as you want. Many people, this will be the last move that they make. They will spend the rest of their lives in these homes and hopefully be very happy doing that. So they're very much designed to be permanent. And I think that's a good thing also in terms of the community, because people are, like I said, choosing to live here and make their home in this building and in these communities. And so we hope that, you know, the community kind of rallies around and welcomes their new neighbors. And over time that those relationships grow. So they're definitely designed to be permanent.
Interesting. Great. And then we have a question. So the modular designs are very beautiful. She was curious to know who the landscape architect is that's working on the park space and whether these will be kind of public space.
Right. Okay, great question. Yeah, we're working with a great landscape architect, Scott Burbridge from Baker Turner Landscape Architects, on all three of the projects I show you tonight. In terms of the different types of outdoor spaces, so in each project there are spaces that are outdoor amenities for the residents, but also outdoor spaces that contribute to the public and the adjacent community. So for example, on the 11 Macy site, there's a whole public through block landscape connection that we showed you earlier, and that's intended to be completely public, and it's an amenity for the neighborhood. On the Harrison site, the park that you saw is directly to the south of the building, and that is not part of the project, but it's a city-owned park that is being designed in conjunction with our design. And then in terms of the third project I show you in the rural area in the Durham region, that is intended to be a sort of complete integration of the public as well as the residents, where the public comes in and use many of the outdoor spaces as well.
Great. And then we have another, building on the previous question, the supportive transitional aspect of the housing. What kind of programming is the city interested in supporting? And alternatively, are there any current conversations with any service providers?
Yeah, so some of the supports I think I mentioned earlier are things like food programming. Food is a big one in supportive housing. It's nutrition, sleep, and community are three very important factors to all of our lives running smoothly. So, the food programming is an important part. Navigation to healthcare is another big one. Reconnection with family and friends, often peer programming so that residents within the supportive housing will support each other and bring their skills and share their knowledge and skills. We often see, again, navigation to other community facilities. I think a big one is, immediately when people move in, it's really simple things like, finding a dentist, finding an optician. Many people, I love the point that Kellie made about the reading light, but many people will have been without spectacles and glasses for some time and actually will need to go get their prescription updated and so that they can, read a book or whatever it is, play on their screen or watch TV. So those things are all really important. It's really about supporting residents to find the kind of address some of the issues in their life, whatever that might be, and helping them to stabilize and hoping that they can, get happy and healthy in their new home. I wish there was a very comprehensive provincial programming for support for that. Unfortunately, right now there isn't. However, there are organizations out there who are very effective in kind of pulling together different funding sources, and we've been working with an Indigenous housing group to try and connect to people who might have money or inclination to kind of bring funding together, and also with the Alliance to End Homelessness as a partner of ours who can kind of help navigate with the community housing sector to find health dollars or other support dollars that might be out there that we're not aware of.
Okay. With regard to modular housing designed to be going in quickly, what is the process for site assessments, including environmental assessments and connections to utilities?
I can probably speak to that. Yeah, certainly both of those are important things to consider. In terms of environmental assessment, because these projects have to be delivered so quickly, any site that is contaminated that would require remediation would not be suitable. And so it's unlikely that any of those would be selected as possible sites. On the site servicing side, that's a bit easier because these are fairly low impact buildings. I think as mentioned earlier, most of these designs are, use only electricity, and they are, only 50 units. So the viability of the sites are not as difficult from a site servicing perspective.
Then we have a question about the size of the units. So currently they're small studio apartment type setups. Are there plans going forward for larger units that might accommodate families?
It's something to bear in mind. I guess the key driver for this initial pilot was, even before COVID, to take the pressure off the shelter system, and the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness, either in a shelter or outdoors, are single. And so, it was important for us to kind of focus on that. There's nothing about modular construction which means it has to be single. I mean, Daniel might want to speak to that. It's a great option for family housing, but not something we currently have included in our pilot.
Yeah, I mean, these modules can be designed to be, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom units, right? Where you start to combine 2 modules or 3 modules, depending on the needs. And while it might not be entirely, the need of supportive housing, but certainly if you look broader in terms of affordable housing, it is directly applicable, I would say.
All right, well, we have 3 minutes to go. So if anyone has any last minute questions, quick questions, you can put them in the box there. But before we wrap up, I guess this is where we would clap normally, but can't do that now. Yeah. So this is an ongoing seminar series, and our next seminar will be on December 15th. and that will be looking at the financialization of housing. And you can follow us at our various social media pages, which if you found this event, I'm sure you know how to access those, but we'll be posting our future seminars there, which are to be determined. But thank you all for coming out, and we'll see you at the next one. And thank you to our panelists.